MySQL has a number of useful string functions, and we're going to look at some of them here. But first, let's talk about what a string is. This is a literal string. Select hello world. So hello world is a literal string. You can see it's a number of characters enclosed in single quote marks, and that's how you do a string in SQL. Of course, there's also strings that are stored in a database. So this will select the title column from the album table in the album database. There we go. These are strings also, and string functions apply to these as well. So let's go back to our literal string. And there it is, hello world. And let's say that these two words were coming from different sources. So we'll use a function called concat to concatenate two literal strings. So you remember our function syntax. We have the name of the function, parentheses, and inside the parentheses we have arguments. In this case, there's two arguments separated by a comma. When we run this, it will concatenate hello with world and run them together. There we go. Concat hello world comes out. Hello world run together without the comma and the space, because the comma and the space in this case are simply separating the arguments to the function, and they're not actually part of the string. If we want the comma and the space, we could add that as a separate string inside here. And now we have three strings. We have hello, we have comma space, and we have world. It's a little hard to look at because we're also using a comma and a space to separate the arguments. But when we run it, we'll see we get the result that we're looking for. Hello, comma, space, world. Like I said, that's a little hard to look at. MySQL has another function called concatenate with separator, which is spelled concatenate_WS. And you give the separators the first argument. So I'm going to give a colon as the separator here. And then I use a comma to separate the arguments. So I'm going to take out this comma space string, and now we have three arguments. We have the first argument is the separator that we're going to use, and the second argument is the literal string hello, the third argument is the literal string world. And so what this will do is it'll use this separator to separate all the arguments after it. So we have hello colon world, and if we were to have more arguments, those would all get separated with colons as well. I'll show you a practical example of this a little bit later in the lesson, but right now I want to talk about LPAD and RPAD. And in order to do that, we're going to close our browser. We're going to open up the command line client. Because spaces are hard to see in a web browser, web browsers tend to fold numbers of spaces all into one space. So it's hard to illustrate something that actually uses spaces in a web browser. So go ahead and run the MySQL command line client, and we will take a look at the title column from the album database again. I'm going to use album, select title from album. Remember, you have to use a semicolon to terminate all of your SQL commands in the command line client. And there we have the title column from the album table in the album database. Now, what if we wanted all of these to be right flush? This is something we can use LPAD for. Select LPAD title, comma, 30, comma, space, from album, semicolon. And what this does is it calls the LPAD function. The first argument is what the string is. So in this case, it's the title column from the album database. The second argument is the number of characters that you want to have in the final string, and we'll see what that looks like in a moment. And the third argument is what you're padding it with to make the string that long. And then we have our SQL from album telling it what table to take the column from. And this is what we get. We get the title padded out to 30 characters. So all of these strings are exactly 30 characters long. And if the data wasn't long enough, it pads the left-hand side, that's why it's LPAD, with spaces. If we use RPAD instead, then we get them padded out on the right-hand side to 30 characters. It's good to know also what happens when the padding is less than the length of the string. And what happens is that the string will be truncated to the length that you specify. So if I say select LPAD title 15 space from album, then we get strings that are exactly 15 characters long, and they're truncated at the end. If the string is short enough, in the case of apostrophe or kind of blue or birds of fire, then that's fine. If they're too long, in the case of Two Men with the Blues, then it's truncated to 15 characters. If they're too short, they're padded on the left-hand side. This is what you would expect if your strings are longer than the amount of the padding. So this is really useful for reports that are going to be printed in a fixed width typeface, which reports typically were until just the last few years, and in a lot of places they still are. So that's the LPAD and RPAD functions. I'll go ahead and exit the command line client and go back to the web browser. And I want to show you a practical example of how these are used. This is an example from the CRUD application, and we'll actually see it in place in the CRUD application later on in the course. So here's an SQL statement that's going to show us a few columns from the track table in the album database. And there we have it, the ID, album ID, title, track number, and duration. You'll notice the duration is in number of seconds. That's the length of the track in the number of seconds. And obviously we don't want to display it that way, and I decided to store it that way in the database for certain reasons, but we want to display it as minutes and seconds. Now, there's a function built into MySQL that will display it as hours, minutes, and seconds, which is not what I want, and that looks like this. So you get hours, minutes, and seconds, and a few tracks are long enough for that, and when they are, I'm happy to display, 90 minutes instead of 1 hour and 30 minutes. And so what I really wanted was to display this in minutes and seconds, and so I came up with a way to do it using concat.ws and LPAD, and that looks like this. Go ahead and indent it on another line so that it's obvious and visible. And you remember from the SQL course that white space is ignored in SQL, and it's all just folded into one space, and so this allows us to indent the code so that it looks readable on the page. So here we have a rather long expression, and it uses two functions, concat.ws and LPAD. And when you're looking at a long expression like this, it's best to start in the inside when you read it. This makes it easier to read. So if we look at this part of the expression here, we see we have an LPAD function with duration mod 60, and we'll be explaining that in the section on numeric functions, but in a nutshell, that does a division and gives you the remainder. So we have duration mod 60 as the string, and 2 is the length of the string, and the literal 0 is what to pad it with. And so what this will do is it'll take this duration mod 60, and if it's less than 2 characters long, it will pad it on the left-hand side with zeros. And that gives you things like this here. This duration is 3 minutes and 5 seconds, and you'll see that it'll display as just 3:05 when we're all done with this. And then we have concat.ws, which has 3 arguments. It has the separator, and it has the duration div 60, which is the number of minutes, and this LPAD expression for the number of seconds. So it takes those two values and it concatenates them together with a colon, which is exactly what we want. So that's how this line works. When we press go here, we'll see. We now get the duration in minutes and seconds. So we have 5 minutes here. Down here we have one that's 13 minutes long. We'll notice that it shows the whole 13. It also shows this 06 with a leading 0. We have that in a few places there. So it's padding the left-hand side of that value with a 0. So we have a leading 0 on the seconds. We don't have a leading 0 on the minutes, which is exactly how I think it should be displayed. And so that's why I created it this way. So there is a practical example of these string functions. And of course, MySQL has many string functions available. Most of them are not as commonly used as the concatenation and the padding. And they're all documented on the MySQL website if you're interested in them.